Hi, I'm David Barron, Chief Scientific Officer of the PKD Foundation, and this is the first of our Wednesday webinars, noontime webinars, but good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. I've chosen for my first talk the subject of vasopressin, which has a few names. Arginine vasopressin is one, antidiuretic hormone is another. Argipressin, which I really haven't heard of recently, is also a name for this particular hormone, but they're all the same thing. I want to acknowledge up front that I got much of this information from a recent article in the New England Journal of Medicine by Thomas Burrell, volume 372, and you can see for yourself the exact citation. I, of course, go to Wikipedia, and I learned about vasopressin, of course, in graduate school a long, long time ago, and I actually did some of my own research while in academia, and I show you a couple of publications, giving away my age because they were in the 80s, about how vasopressin causes water flow across certain type of cell in toad urinary bladders. And little did I know that this research would become very pertinent to the topic of PKD in general. So what is vasopressin? Vasopressin is one of the two main hormones made in the hypothalamus and secreted by the posterior pituitary gland. I'll get to what they are exactly. They're in the brain, and I'll show you exactly where they are. And I also want to let you know that vasopressin has a relatively long history in that extracts of the pituitary gland were first shown in 1895 to raise blood pressure, and that's probably where the name came from, vasopressin. This extract also was shown later on to regulate water in the kidney, and that's really the majority of my talk today. The other hormone that's secreted, just so you know, is oxytocin, which is important in pregnancy, and has also been shown, oddly enough, to be the reason why dogs and their humans get along so well. That eye contact actually induces oxytocin secretion from the posterior pituitary gland and is one of the mechanisms why dogs are man's best friend. So where exactly is it made? As I mentioned, it's deep within the brain, and what you see are mostly the frontal lobe. You can see the nose to your left, and in almost the dead center of your skull, there's a very small area of the brain called the hypothalamus, and it makes the hormone and it secretes it into the pituitary gland, which is sometimes called the master gland of your endocrine system or your hormone system. So all this begins in the brain, and it's curious how we're organized, that the brain is really what tells the rest of the body what to do. So vasopressin is a small peptide, and peptides are smaller than your typical protein, but they consist of the same building block. And that building block is one of 20 amino acids. And you can see here what the sequence of those amino acids are. There are abbreviations for them. There's cysteine, and cysteine is an interesting amino acid because it contains sulfur. So you see this yellow molecule here. These are all individual molecules, by the way. The sort of whiter gray are hydrogens, the darker gray are carbons, the reds are oxygen, and here you have a sulfur, actually two sulfurs, because this cysteine here and this cysteine actually bind together, and so this is not a linear peptide. It has its own three-dimensional structure, which is why I'm showing you these three ways to look at what vasopressin is comprised of. So it's these 9 amino acids. These are the amino acid structures here. And the reason cysteine is interesting is because these sulfides in this cysteine and this cysteine form a cross-linkage that give the molecule its three-dimensional structure. So why do we need this hormone? Well, it's because we're about 70% water. Actually, babies are about 85% water. As you get older, you may be 55% water. But we can't sometimes or choose not to get enough of it in our daily lives. If you're a surgeon, for example, and doing a 10-hour operation, you're going to become dehydrated. If you're running a race, you're going to become dehydrated. So the body has to regulate its water content. And that's because whether a species lives in salt water, fresh water, or on the earth, like us, water, like oxygen and nutrition, is critical to life. And some species even carry water around with them, like toads and tortoises. And this is the reason I was studying toads back in the 80s. They actually have a mechanism that responds to vasopressin so that they can take that stored water and hydrate themselves when there is no water in their environment, such as during a drought. So we all need mechanisms for maintaining water homeostasis. Homeostasis is a fancy word for keeping the water in our bodies constant at the ideal level in our blood, so our blood doesn't get too thick or it doesn't get too diluted, and vasopressin is very critical for that homeostasis to be maintained. So how does vasopressin work? And this gets to the mechanism by which new drugs are discovered. So now I'm taking you at a very high magnification to the cell in the kidney, the mammalian kidney, the human kidney, and this is called a renal collecting duct cell, and it's one of the cells in the kidney that has a receptor for vasopressin. So again, you're looking at the molecule of vasopressin, and you're looking at a big protein, which is the vasopressin V2 receptor. V2 stands for the fact that there's also a V1 receptor that is found in different tissues, but let's stick with the kidney right now. And this big membrane protein, which has 7 unique structures, you see them as these cylinders, forms a pocket in which the vasopressin molecule can attach to the receptor, and that causes all sorts of changes within the cell. So where is this molecule in the beginning? It comes out of the blood into an area called the extracellular space, and it binds to this receptor, which triggers something in the intracellular space. And way down at the bottom of the slide would be not the basolateral part of the cell, but the apical part of the cell, and that's the part of the cell that is exposed to the forming urine. So this is really, at a molecular level, what vasopressin does. It binds to its receptor, and that triggers a lot of activities. I just want to mention again, and this is not meant to be depressing at all, it's to give you an idea of how long it takes sometimes in science to really come to a mature understanding of what the body is all about. So as I mentioned, it was discovered in 1895 because somebody was curious exactly what the pituitary gland did and decided to look at the pharmacological activity of ground up pituitary extracts. And it took until the 90s to actually discover water channels that are affected by vasopressin. It was known early on that it increased blood pressure and it decreased urine excretion, but it took much longer than that for this information to become understood well enough that you could actually design mimics of vasopressin that bind the receptor and prevent vasopressin from binding to the receptor, which causes inhibition of what vasopressin does. And one of the drugs that were developed to inhibit the action of vasopressin, and I'll tell you why that's important shortly, was tolvaptan. And so 1895, the first discovery of something active in the pituitary gland that affects water and blood pressure. 2014, first approvals of tolvaptan for the treatment of autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease. And that's now the case in Japan, in Canada, and in the European Union. So how might an antagonist of vasopressin work in polycystic kidney disease? It would keep the urine dilute, and dilute urine is generally good because it means the kidney isn't working as hard. And it also inhibits the formation of, again, long scientific words, my apologies, cyclic adenosine monophosphate. This is a small molecule, often called cyclic AMP, that most cells in the body have. And what it does is it rises in its concentration in the cells of the kidney when vasopressin binds to the receptors in those kidney cells. So vasopressin causes an increase in cyclic AMP. So what does cyclic AMP do? Well, it causes cells to proliferate, in other words, divide. And in the case of polycystic kidneys, that's not a good thing because it means that the cysts are getting larger. Cyclic AMP also causes chloride secretion in these same polycystic kidney cells, and that's also not good because in addition to the walls of the cysts growing, they're ballooning out because fluid is being secreted into those cysts. So that's really how cyst growth occurs, through cyclic AMP. Now, this isn't the only mechanism. There are a multitude of mechanisms by which the cysts grow, but we're concentrating on vasopressin today. In future Wednesday webinars, we'll talk about other pathways that are potential targets for new drugs that would also prevent or at least diminish the growth of the cysts. So therefore, the vasopressin antagonists, such as tolvaptan, would be expected to have a therapeutic effect in PKD, because if tolvaptan binds to the vasopressin receptor and not vasopressin, cyclic AMP does not rise, and therefore proliferation does not occur, and chloride secretion does not occur, so the cysts won't grow as quickly. And this is just to show you in a schematic how this actually works. So vasopressin binds to its receptor, and I should add that vasopressin in normal individuals and in healthy patients with PKD does perform a physiologic function. When you need to conserve water, vasopressin, such as if you're running or exercising, binds to its receptor, and through a variety of pathways, I'm very simplifying this, but let's assume that this is the enzyme that makes cyclic AMP, adds this square molecule, which is actually a water pore called aquaporin, and it goes to the membrane of that collecting duct cell that we saw at much higher magnification in an earlier slide, and it takes water out of the urine, and this takes some energy and puts some pressure on the kidney so that the water can go to the blood and make sure that the concentration of the blood is normal. So this is what vasopressin does physiologically. However, in patients with PKD, this is not necessarily a good thing, except in the case when you're exercising, for example. So we would want to antagonize vasopressin, and that drug would be tolvaptan. There are others that bind to this receptor as well. But when you see this red X, that means that vasopressin has been replaced by a drug such as tolvaptan, and the water stays in the urine. And so this cell doesn't have to work hard to make water flow from the urine back into the blood. And for patients with PKD, that's a good thing for most of your day. The less vasopressin that you secrete from your brain, the better off you are. And you can do that pharmacologically, and you can also do that by making sure that you stay hydrated and by drinking appropriate amounts of water. So this is a simplified schematic of really what vasopressin does and how it's related to the treatment of AD-PKD. I might add, although it's much more difficult to develop a drug for children, that I suspect that this same mechanism would be of benefit to people with the recessive form of polycystic kidney disease. So what happens here is that vasopressin in patients with polycystic kidney disease who already have cysts, of course, it raises cyclic AMP, and like I mentioned, that causes the wall of the cysts to become bigger because the cells are dividing and creating more cells, and secretion is occurring in the cysts. This is not something that happens over a minute or 2 minutes. It takes years, as all of you know who have PKD. This process takes time. So that if you're in your early 20s, this is just beginning. If you're in your 50s, 60s, or 70s, you likely have these much larger cysts which compress adjacent normal tissue. So with an inhibitor of vasopressin that prevents its binding to the vasopressin receptor in the kidney, and that would be tolvaptan in this case, then cyclic AMP does not rise and the cysts do not grow. But over time, even with a drug like tolvaptan, this growth will ultimately still continue, but at a slower rate. For example, the data on tolvaptan show that rather than the cysts growing at 5.7% per year compounded, they grow about half that rate. So that over time, one would expect that these cysts would compress adjacent normal tissue much less, and that over the decades of your life, the hope is that the possibility of going into end-stage renal failure is reduced. And one of the complications of drug development in PKD, and why it's so important that we have volunteers for studies, is that it takes a long time to show these effects. And the FDA wants to be sure that while they acknowledge that tolvaptan works, they want to be sure that if you're going to be taking it for a long time, that it's also safe. So tolvaptan reduces the growth of cysts by decreasing the elevation in cyclic AMP, and therefore the rate of proliferation goes down. And as I mentioned, it's been improved in increasing areas with large numbers of people, such as Japan and Europe, Canada and Switzerland as well, and that tolvaptan is still pending. A decision in the US by the FDA to approve it is still pending a completion of an ongoing phase 3B study called Reprise. And for those of you who are interested, I think they're still enrolling in this trial. And curiously, as I mentioned, Vasopressin causes a lot of water to flow into your blood, for example, when you're running a marathon, but sometimes too much water flows into your blood, and the salt in your blood actually gets diluted to the point that it's really dangerous to your heart rhythm. So tolvaptan is actually already approved in the United States for the treatment of hyponatremia, meaning a low concentration of sodium in your blood, which occurs in some types of congestive heart failure. So, as I mentioned, there is more to PKD than vasopressin. There are numerous other cellular pathways or targets that exist for new drugs to be developed. So the foundation, of course, supports the approval of tolvaptan in the U.S., and we're helping by making sure that people are aware of the trials that they can enroll in. And the foundation supports research into multiple other cellular pathways. I've told you about the cyclic AMP pathway, but there are other pathways, and this will be the subject in July, I believe the 16th, about cilia, which are little finger-like projections that come out of certain cells in the kidney. That might sound strange, but I'll try to clear that up next month. And these pathways and this particular organelle, or a little structure of the cells in the kidney, might also be targeted to reduce the growth of PKD cysts. And it is really that target and that goal to reduce the growth of cysts or to stop their growth altogether that really is going to lead to the ultimate, if not cure, a therapeutic advance such that the time to end-stage renal disease or kidney failure can be extended such that it is no longer an issue in the disease. And the foundation supports research also into the genetics of PKD. It turns out that individual families typically have their own unique mutations. The PKD for most of these families has similar outcomes, but it's of scientific importance that we really understand these mutations and how they affect the cells. So there is a lot of research that the foundation supports into the genetics and to the mutated proteins, polycystin 1 and polycystin 2. The reasons that these are of interest is they are part of the cilium that I'm going to talk about next month. And this is actually where the mutations occur, but it's still not clear how these mutations ultimately result in cysts. So this is a very important endeavor, and our current research grants are directed towards solving these issues. So to conclude, a drug that inhibits the physiologic effect of vasopressin reduces the growth of cysts in autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease. And this is one of the mechanisms that are active in the progression of the disease, and I believe also in the case of autosomal recessive polycystic kidney disease, because these same cysts are growing and children often require transplants very early in their lives. So what can you do to minimize vasopressin secretion? So on the advice of your doctor, drink water. The more water you drink, the less vasopressin is secreted. My mouth is dry right now because I've been talking for a while. It's telling me it's time to have a drink, and water is the best solution and will prevent the vasopressin being secreted from my pituitary right now that's acting on my transplanted kidney, telling it to conserve water. So I wanted to alert you to some upcoming events. Again, the monthly webinars where you're going to find out what cilia do and lots of other topics as the year progresses. And I want to call to your attention the evening webinar series where TBD has been replaced by Dr. Arlene Chapman, who's the new nephrology section chief at the University of Chicago, and she'll speak about kidney stones, which are prevalent in PKD. And then, of course, we're excited that the PKD National Convention will be held in Orlando in Florida in June of 2016. So stay tuned to the PKD website /convention for updates on this meeting. So I'd like to stop by thanking you for all that you do for the foundation, and I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you may have.
Great. Thanks, David, so much. That was a really great overview of vasopressin, and we do have a few questions. And if you have them or you're thinking, I don't quite understand this part or that part, please feel free to send that in via the chat box there in your webinar software, and we will see what we can do about answering them. So one question we have is, does that mean that people who are taking tolvaptan will get dehydrated more easily while exercising because of the vasopressin suppression? So will people get more dehydrated if they're taking tolvaptan?
That's a very good question. One of the effects of tolvaptan, and this is part of it, the physiology of vasopressin actually, is because it is inhibiting vasopressin, you will generally be thirstier when you're taking tolvaptan, and you're likely to drink more water. Again, this is something that is premature to discuss in the U.S. because tolvaptan hasn't been approved yet. But if it were, I think that's a good question for your nephrologist. But my suspicion is that exercising for an hour or two is not going to have any significant consequence because, of course, you'll be drinking before you exercise and you'll be drinking during your exercise if you're running or biking, and you'll drink afterwards, as anyone does who exercises. And if they're not drinking, whether they have PKD or not, it's probably not a good thing.
Very good. And I will mention something that I think I was muted when I was saying earlier, but I want to remind everyone that we do not want you to take our medical advice as on its own. We would love for you to ask questions and get responses and take that information to your physician or your medical team and have a conversation with them, because obviously we can't know all of the specifics of your medical condition. So be sure to take all of this great information back and talk with your doctor about it and let them know what you've heard here so that they can take that into consideration. And we are getting some more, excuse me, some more great questions. Someone has mentioned that the side effects of tolvaptan are horrendous. And I'm not sure exactly which part they're talking about, but David, do you have any comment on the clinical side effects on that drug?
All I can say is that if you drink a lot, whether you are taking tolvaptan or not, you go to the bathroom a lot. It's really quite simple. If you carry a water bottle around with you, which many people do, whether they have PKD or not, which is a good thing in my opinion, you'll tend to have to urinate more often. And I think for some people on tolvaptan, this may not be very tolerable, particularly if you have nocturia, which means you have to wake up in the middle of the night to pee. I think that the dosages for tolvaptan are designed so that you get a lower dose so you're less likely to have to go in the middle of the night. But horrendous is a very strong term, and I would stress that the drug has been approved in Europe with 400 million people, in Japan with 180 million people. Their regulatory agencies, which are as strict as the FDA, have concluded that for the majority of people, this is a safe and tolerable drug. I would add that many drugs for some people are horrendous, and your physician will either take you off the drug or suggest an alternative.
Great. Someone has asked if you have any comment or information on the impact of dietary sodium intake on vasopressin secretion.
Yes, so I will have to confess some ignorance here, but salt is something that raises blood pressure, and high salt in the blood activates vasopressin. And what I did not talk about today was the pressin part of vasopressin, and that means that there are nerves in your vasculature or your blood vessels that detect pressure, and when there's a lot of salt, vasopressin is secreted to dilute that salt, and that raises your blood pressure. So vasopressin not only regulates water, but it regulates blood pressure, and salt causes a cycle of events that raises your blood pressure. So there are two basic functions for vasopressin. One is regulation of blood pressure, and the other is the regulation of water, which is really to maintain the proper concentration of salt, which is sodium and chloride, in the blood.
So kind of a follow-up to that, and I'm not sure, David, if you'll be able to answer this or not, but someone is saying that they consume they have a low salt diet to keep their blood pressure in check. So then they're thirsty and they drink twice the normal amount of water. And I'm not, I don't know exactly what they mean by that. Their serum sodium is low and their serum chloride is even lower, so they consume KCl to avoid day-long exertion headaches. Is there a better way? This is a pretty specific question, and so don't feel like you have to answer as specifically as that. Oh, and they say that they drink about 2 gallons of water a day.
2 gallons is a large amount, and that could lead to a low sodium concentration in the blood, regardless of whether you have PKD or not. Without giving any advice, I look to marathon runners, particularly first-time marathon runners, who are told, drink water, drink water, drink water, and some drink so much that they actually dilute their blood, and that can lead to cardiovascular issues. Low sodium diets, to my knowledge, don't make you want to drink water. I, from my personal experience, drinking high sodium makes me, eating a high sodium meal tends to make me thirsty. So I can't answer that part of the question because it's contrary to my experience with high salt versus low salt.
And this is a pretty specific question, so we may also get some outside input and see if we can get an answer from someone on our SAC as well. So maybe David can work with someone to get that if we need to. Okay, we do have a few other questions here. So how does CAMP, so C-A-M-P, operate during cyst infections, and how is vasopressin impacted by that, or is it, or do you know?
That's an interesting question, because in an infection, cells are injured and some cells die, and when you have cell death, you want to replace those cells. So cyclic AMP does rise and is part of the mechanism by which normal cells divide and replace the cells that were damaged by the infection. So vasopressin doesn't necessarily have a direct role in that. Cyclic AMP levels in the cell are regulated by a lot more mechanisms than vasopressin alone. So that's a good question, and cell proliferation is good because that's what happens when you get a minor cut on your skin. The skin grows back, and unfortunately in PKD, when some of these cells get the signal to divide, they keep dividing and create more cells than are needed, and that's how the cysts are actually formed.
Okay. Okay. Someone is asking, and I will remind you that we cannot give medical advice, but someone is asking, maybe we can ask you a personal question, David. How much water do you drink in a day? Someone wants a general guideline, and we don't really do that, but how much water do you drink in a day?
I don't measure it, and I think my wife is on the line, and she would probably scold me right now. I have a very fancy water container that keeps it nice and cold during the day, but I don't use it as often as I should. I think that I am post-transplant, and so I don't have a kidney with PKD. I still have PKD, of course, and its other manifestations. But just like anyone with kidneys, drinking water is a good idea, and I don't drink as much as I probably should.
Yeah, the amount of water to drink each day has been kind of an ongoing conversation, and we have a new patient handbook that is coming out. The digital version is available online now, and the print version will be available in the next few weeks. And so there's a whole portion in there about water and sort of the benefits of drinking a normal amount of water and maybe an extra amount of water for a PKD patient. So look to that for guidance, and that was written by actually by Ben Cowley, one of our SAC members, and so that'll be a great resource for people to use for that guideline.
And just for those of you who don't know, SAC stands for Scientific Advisory Committee, and these are a group of nephrologists and scientists who are critical to the work of the foundation.
Thanks for that clarification, David. Okay, I think we have maybe one or two last questions, and that's great because we'll end just in time to get everyone back to work after their lunch hour. So, and this is one I don't know that we can really answer this. How much slower is the progression of cysts with tolvaptan according to the clinical studies that have been conducted?
My understanding is that, as I mentioned, the cysts grow approximately 5.7% per year. And this is not the same for everybody. This is an average. And in the studies of tolvaptan, that growth was approximately cut by 50%. So in other words, a little under 3% per year. One of the issues that comes out of these types of data, and probably why the FDA has taken longer than other regulatory agencies in the consideration of tolvaptan, is how does this play out over decades, not over the year or two that the drug was studied. In other words, drug companies can't study a drug for 30 years before it's approved. The government can't do that either. The cost would be absolutely prohibitive. So we are predicting that this growth rate reduction will lengthen the time that it takes to reach ESRD, or end-stage renal disease. And our fervent hope, and what the foundation really stands for, is that we will delay that progression long enough that, frankly, you'll die of a natural cause other than your PKD, at least in terms of its renal manifestations. But that takes typically decades, as many of older PKD patients know? So that's a great question, and it remains to be seen if that growth reduction, how that plays out 10, 20, or 30 years later.
Great. And we had several more questions come in, but we are going to just go ahead and answer one more. And then for those questions that came in that we don't get to, I'll work with David to answer those and put it on the website with the recording of this webinar. But the last one that came in that I think we'll answer, someone is asking, do you know if vasopressin plays a role in depression?
The simple answer is no. I would add that I mentioned oxytocin, which is one of the other hormone that's secreted by the posterior pituitary. And oxytocin, I was making a joke in a way about dogs, but it was not a joke, it's true. Both in males and females, oxytocin is released in situations that generally would make you feel good from an emotional perspective. I mean, you look into a puppy's eyes and you wonder why it makes you feel good, or you watch a cat video of cats doing crazy things, it makes you feel good, and there's some evidence that oxytocin is related to that, and that vasopressin, although it doesn't have the same strength that oxytocin does, may have some of those same effects. So again, I have to go back to the simple answer is no, I don't know, but what little I do know suggests that vasopressin, if anything, probably has a positive effect on emotions.
All right. Well, that is all the time we have today. Thank you so much, David, for all of this information and for your ongoing guidance and for just being a wonderful advocate and resource for our patients. I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for participating, for joining us here in the middle of the day, for submitting the questions that you did. We really appreciate your involvement. The PKD Foundation appreciates the opportunity to provide you with the best possible education. I will email out a quick survey to everyone who registered and attended the webinar. So if you wouldn't mind just completing that and submitting it, it shouldn't take you too long, but it does help us to use your responses and develop additional resources and programs for the future. And when you do this survey, if you have additional topics that you're interested in from a basic science standpoint, please include that so that we can add them to the list of things that we've already kind of decided we'd like to talk with you about. If you need to reach out to us directly, you can email us at education@pkdcure.org, and a member of our education team will get back to you. One quick thing I'd like to say is on the slide that talked about future events, future education events coming up, we had Wednesday, July 16th for the next one. That is actually the 15th. We had a little mistype there in the date. So the 16th is a Thursday, and we will be done. But on the 15th, we will be around to talk with you about cilia. So get excited for that coming up. On behalf of everyone here at the PKD Foundation, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next month. Bye-bye.